Good evening all and welcome back to Paranoia Files. Tonight I bring you 8 of the most disturbing true Appalachian deep woods horror stories ever documented. These accounts are not the product of campfire tales or mountain folklore, but verified testimonies from individuals whose journeys into the ancient forests became nightmares they can never forget. Each story draws us deeper into the shadowed hollows and endless ridges of the Appalachian wilderness, where encounters with the unexplainable have left permanent scars on those who survived to speak of them. From vanishings that defy all logical explanation to confrontations with forces both human and otherwise, these narratives reveal a side of the mountains that few are willing to acknowledge. Every detail has been carefully preserved from original accounts, maintaining the integrity and authenticity of these experiences, though certain names and specific locations have been altered to protect the privacy and safety of those who came forward. If you have not yet subscribed to Paranoia Files, I invite you to join our community of truth seekers and activate the notification bell so you are alerted each time we venture into the unknown together. Please share your own experiences in the comments below and let me know which of tonight's stories disturbed you the most, or if you have ever encountered something in the deep woods that you cannot explain. Back in the fall of 2018, my brother Harold and I decided to tackle a section of the Appalachian Trail we had been planning for years. We were experienced hikers, the kind who never took shortcuts, always filed our permits, and kept our gear maintained like our lives depended on it. Because out there they did. Harold was the older one by 3 years, and he had been hiking these mountains since before I could walk. He taught me everything I knew about respecting the wilderness, reading weather patterns, and understanding that the Appalachian forest was not some theme park. It was wild country, ancient and indifferent to human life. We had been planning this particular trek for close to 2 years. It was a remote section of trail in North Carolina, one that wound through the Pisgah National Forest and cut deep into areas where cell service disappeared and the tree canopy grew so thick that sunlight barely reached the forest floor. We chose late October specifically because the crowds would be gone and the fall colors would be at their peak. Harold had mapped every mile, cataloged every water source, and even printed physical maps as backup in case our GPS units failed. That is the kind of careful man he was. We started at the trailhead just after dawn on a Thursday morning. The ranger station was open and we filed our permits like we always did, told the ranger our expected route, and gave him our emergency contact information. He was an older guy, maybe in his 60s, with a weathered face that suggested he had spent most of his life in these mountains. He looked over our permits, nodded his approval, and then gave us the standard warnings about bears, weather changes, and staying on marked trails. We thanked him, shouldered our packs, and headed into the woods. The first day was perfect. The trail was well maintained, the weather held clear and cool, and by late afternoon we had covered nearly 12 miles without incident. We found our planned campsite just before sunset, a small clearing near a creek with a stone fire ring that previous hikers had built. Harold set up his tent on the east side of the clearing while I took the west. We filtered water from the creek, cooked freeze-dried meals on our camp stoves, and sat by a small fire as the darkness closed in around us. Harold was in good spirits that night. He talked about bringing his son out here in a few years, teaching him the same lessons our father had taught us. I remember feeling content, grateful to be out there with my brother in a place that felt timeless and sacred. We turned in around 9:30. The plan was to wake at dawn, break camp, and push another 14 miles the next day. I fell asleep to the sound of the creek and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. I do not know what time it was when I woke, but it was still dark and the fire had burned down to nothing but embers. I heard Harold unzip his tent, and then I heard his footsteps on the litter as he walked away from camp. I figured he was heading off to relieve himself before going back to sleep, so I rolled over and tried to drift off again. Maybe 2 minutes passed, maybe 3. And then I heard my name. Harold called out to me, but his voice was coming from the wrong direction. He had walked south away from the trail and deeper into the woods, but the voice calling my name was coming from the north, from somewhere beyond the creek. I sat up in my tent, confused and suddenly very awake. The voice called again. It sounded exactly like Harold. Same tone, same cadence, but it was definitely coming from the opposite direction. I unzipped my tent and stepped out into the cold night air. I called back to him, asking if he was okay. There was no answer. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam across the campsite. Harold's tent was still there, the flap open and swaying slightly in the breeze. His boots were sitting outside the entrance. I walked over to where he had headed into the woods and called his name again. Nothing. I turned toward the creek, toward the direction where I had heard that voice, and called out once more. Still nothing. I went back to my tent, pulled on my boots, and grabbed my larger flashlight along with my knife. I was not panicking yet, but something felt deeply wrong. Harold would not wander off barefoot in the middle of the night. He would not leave camp without his flashlight. And he certainly would not have gone far enough that he could not hear me shouting. I followed his tracks into the woods, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The tracks were clear in the soft earth, heading south in a straight line. I followed them for maybe 50 yards, calling his name every few steps. And then the tracks just stopped. Not gradually, not at a stream or a rocky outcropping where they might have become harder to follow. They simply ended in the middle of a small clearing, as if Harold had been plucked straight up into the air. I stood there, shining my light in every direction, looking for some explanation. There were no other footprints, no drag marks, no sign of a struggle, just his tracks leading to that spot, and then nothing. I shouted his name until my voice went hoarse. I searched the area in widening circles, looking for any indication of where he might have gone. I found nothing. As the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I ran back to camp, grabbed my satellite communicator, and activated the emergency beacon. Then I returned to the clearing where his tracks ended and waited. The search and rescue team arrived by mid-morning. They brought dogs, drones, and more volunteers than I could count. I showed them the clearing, showed them where the tracks ended, and they spread out in every direction. The dogs picked up Harold's scent and followed it to the exact same spot where I had lost his trail. And then they lost it too. The handlers seemed confused, frustrated. One of them told me he had never seen anything like it. On the second day of searching, they found Harold's pack. It was sitting in the middle of a game trail about a quarter mile from where his tracks had ended. The pack was upright, leaning against a tree as if someone had carefully set it there. Inside was all of his gear, his food, his water filter, everything exactly as it should have been. But 20 feet away, they found his boots. They were placed side by side, laces tied, sitting in the center of a small clearing that the search team had already passed through twice before. The rangers could not explain it, neither could the search and rescue coordinator. They brought in additional teams, expanded the search radius to 10 miles, and combed through the forest for 2 weeks. They found nothing else. No clothing, no signs of injury, no indication that Harold had been attacked by an animal or fallen and hurt himself. It was as if he had simply ceased to exist after walking 50 yards from camp. The official report listed Harold as a lost hiker. They suggested that he might have become disoriented, wandered farther than expected, and succumbed to exposure or injury in a location that searchers had not yet reached. But I was there. I saw where his tracks ended. I saw how his gear had been arranged, and I heard that voice calling my name from the wrong direction, sounding exactly like my brother, but coming from a place he could not possibly have been. The search was called off after 3 weeks. My family held a memorial service, though we had no body to bury. People told me that Harold had died doing what he loved, that the mountains had claimed him, that I needed to find peace with what had happened. But I could not find peace. I could not accept that my brother had simply gotten lost and died out there. Not Harold, not someone who knew those woods better than most people know their own neighborhoods. 6 months later, I went back. I know it was irrational. I know the searchers had covered every inch of that area and found nothing. But I had to see it again. I had to stand in that clearing where his tracks ended and try to make sense of what had happened. I filed a permit, told the same ranger where I was going, and hiked back to our campsite. It looked exactly as I remembered it, though nature had reclaimed the fire ring and new growth had started to cover the areas where our tents had been. I walked to the clearing where Harold's footprints had ended. I stood there in the afternoon sunlight, listening to the birds and the wind in the trees, and I called his name. I do not know why I did it. Maybe I was hoping for closure. Maybe I was hoping for a miracle. But what I got was something else entirely. I heard my name. It was Harold's voice, clear as day, calling to me from somewhere deep in the forest. It was not an echo. It was not my imagination. It was his voice, and it was calling me the same way it had called to me that night. I stood frozen, every instinct screaming at me to run back to the trail, to get out of those woods as fast as I could. But part of me wanted to follow that voice. Part of me wanted to walk into the trees and find my brother, no matter what that meant. I did not follow it. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the tree line, and then I turned and ran. I ran back to the trail, back to my car, and I did not stop until I was miles away from that forest. I have not been back since. I do not think I ever will. Harold is still listed as missing. The case is still technically open, though no one is actively searching anymore. Our parents have accepted that he is gone. Our younger sister has moved on with her life. But I cannot let it go. I cannot stop thinking about that voice, about where his tracks ended, about the way his pack and boots were arranged, as if someone or something had wanted them to be found. I have spent years researching similar cases. There are more than anyone realizes. Experienced hikers vanishing without a trace in national forests and parks. Search dogs losing the scent in impossible places. Gear found arranged in ways that make no sense. And in many of these cases, family members report hearing the voices of the missing calling out to them, luring them deeper into the woods. There is something in those mountains, something old and patient and hungry. It knows how to mimic voices, how to confuse and disorient, how to make people walk willingly into places they can never return from. I do not know what it is. I do not know if it is one thing or many. But I know it took my brother, and I know it tried to take me too. Every year on the anniversary of Harold's disappearance, I receive a phone call from an unknown number. When I answer, there is silence on the other end for a few seconds, and then I hear breathing. Not heavy or menacing, just the sound of someone breathing. And then, just before the line goes dead, I hear my name whispered in Harold's voice. I have changed my number 4 times. It does not matter. The call still comes. I do not hike anymore. I do not go into the woods unless I absolutely have to, and when I do, I never go alone. I never go at night, and I never ever respond if I hear someone calling my name from a direction that does not make sense. Because I know now that not everything that sounds human is human, and not everything that calls your name wants to help you. Harold is gone. But whatever took him is still out there, still waiting in the deep places where the trees grow thick and the sunlight does not reach. And it is still calling. My name is Eugene, and I am 67 years old. For 43 of those years, I carried a secret that ate at me every single day. I am telling this now because Dorothy deserves better than the lie everyone believes, and because I cannot take this guilt to my grave. What I am about to tell you is the truth. It is ugly and it is shameful, but it is the truth. And if there is any justice left in this world, maybe speaking these words will finally bring Dorothy home. In 1981, I was 24 years old and living in a hollow so deep in the West Virginia mountains that most maps did not even show it. My family had been making moonshine in those hills for 3 generations, and by the time I was old enough to help, it was the only income we had. My father had died when I was 19, leaving me with my mother, my younger brother, and a copper still hidden in a cave system that snaked through the mountains like veins through a body. It was illegal work, but it was the only work there was. The coal mines had dried up, the logging companies had moved on, and the government did not care if people like us lived or died as long as we stayed quiet and out of sight. I ran the operation with my cousin Wade. He was 2 years older than me, meaner than a snake, and the only person I knew who understood those mountains as well as I did. We had buyers who would drive up from Charleston, from Huntington, from as far away as Pittsburgh. They wanted the real stuff, the kind you could not get in stores, and they paid good money for it. We made enough to keep food on the table and keep my mother in her medications. It was not a life I was proud of, but it was the life I had. Dorothy came into the picture in the spring of that year. She was from a neighboring hollow, 22 years old, with dark hair that fell past her shoulders and a smile that could make you forget every stupid thing you had ever done. She had been helping her uncle distribute shine for years, and she knew the back roads and game trails better than anyone. Wade brought her in to help with deliveries because she did not draw attention the way we did. A young woman driving a beat-up station wagon was far less suspicious than 2 rough-looking men in a pickup truck. I fell for her almost immediately. She was smart and tough, and she did not take any nonsense from Wade or anyone else. She would show up at the cave where we worked, help us load the jars into crates, and then drive them down to wherever the buyers were waiting. She always came back with the money counted to the penny and never asked for more than her share. I started finding excuses to be around when she came by. We would talk while loading the car, and slowly, over the course of that summer, we became friends. I wanted more than friendship, but Dorothy had made it clear she was not interested in getting involved with anyone in this business. She had plans to save money and get out. Maybe move to Roanoke or Charlotte and find real work. I respected that, even though it hurt. The trouble started in August. Wade had been talking to some buyers from out of state, people we did not know, people who wanted to purchase in bulk. I did not like it. Our business had always been small and local, and expanding meant taking risks. But Wade was greedy, and he convinced me that one big sale could set us up for months. So we agreed to meet these buyers at a campsite deep in the national forest, miles from any road, where no ranger or law enforcement would stumble across us. We brought Dorothy with us because we needed her car to transport half the product. The meeting was set for 10 o'clock at night. We arrived early, set up in the clearing, and waited. The buyers showed up right on time. There were 3 of them, 2 men and a woman, all in their 30s, all looking like they had stepped out of some city and had no business being in these woods. They inspected the product, tested it, and seemed satisfied. Then they started negotiating the price. Wade had quoted them one number, but now they wanted to pay less. Wade refused. The argument escalated quickly. I tried to calm everyone down, but one of the men pulled a gun. Not pointing it at anyone, just holding it at his side, making it clear that they were not asking anymore. Wade went quiet for a second, and I thought maybe he would back down. But then he moved fast, faster than I expected, and he had his own gun out. There was shouting, and then there was a shot. The male buyer who had pulled the gun first went down, just dropped right there in the dirt. The woman screamed. The other man started backing away, hands up, begging Wade not to shoot. But Wade was panicking now. He fired twice more, hitting the second man in the chest. The woman ran. She made it maybe 20 feet before Wade shot her in the back. It happened so fast that I did not have time to react. One moment we were arguing about money, and the next moment there were 3 bodies on the ground and Wade was standing there with the gun still smoking in his hand. Dorothy had been waiting by her car, far enough away that she had not been part of the argument. But she had seen everything. I looked at her and saw the terror in her eyes. She knew. She knew what Wade had just done, and she knew we were all in trouble now. Wade turned to me and his face was cold. He told me we needed to bury the bodies and get out of there. I wanted to refuse. I wanted to tell him we needed to go to the police, turn ourselves in, and hope for mercy. But I was young and I was scared, and I did not know what else to do. So I helped him. We dragged the bodies into the woods, found a cave entrance about a half-mile from the campsite, and carried them down into the darkness. There was a pit in that cave, deep and narrow, and we threw the bodies down into it. Then we covered the entrance with brush and rocks and prayed that no one would ever find them. Dorothy did not say a word the entire time. She just stood there watching us, her face pale and her hands shaking. When we were done, Wade walked up to her and told her that if she ever spoke about what she had seen, he would kill her and everyone in her family. He said it calm and cold, like he was giving directions to the store. Dorothy nodded. She got in her car and drove away, and I did not see her again for 2 weeks. When I finally did see her, she looked like she had not slept in days. She told me she could not stop thinking about those people, about their families who would never know what happened to them. I told her I was sorry, that I never wanted any of that to happen, but that we had to stay quiet. She asked me if I was really going to let Wade get away with murder. I told her I did not have a choice. She looked at me with something between pity and disgust, and then she left. 3 days later, Dorothy disappeared. Her car was found abandoned on a logging road about 10 miles from her home. The driver's side door was open, her keys were still in the ignition, and her purse was on the passenger seat. There were no signs of a struggle, no indication of where she had gone. The local police organized a search party. They combed the woods for days and found nothing. Eventually, the case went cold. People assumed Dorothy had gotten lost in the woods or maybe had run away to start a new life somewhere else. But I knew the truth. Wade had killed her. He had killed her because she was a witness, because she could not be trusted to keep quiet, because he was a monster who had already killed 3 people and did not see any reason not to kill a 4th. I knew it, but I did not say anything. I was a coward. I was terrified that if I went to the police, Wade would kill me too or hurt my family. So I stayed silent. Wade and I stopped working together after that. I told him I was done with the moonshine business, and he did not argue. He moved away a few years later, went down to Tennessee or Georgia, and I have not heard from him since. I stayed in the hollow, took care of my mother until she passed, and tried to live a quiet life. But the guilt never left me. Every time I saw a missing person poster with Dorothy's face on it, every time her mother would ask if anyone had heard anything, every time I drove past that logging road where her car was found, I felt like I was drowning. I know where those buyers are buried. I can draw a map to that cave, describe the exact location of the pit where we threw them. And I believe I know where Dorothy is too. There is another cave system about 3 miles from where her car was found. Wade used to talk about it, said it was a good place to hide things because no one ever went there. I think that is where he put her. I think he took her there, killed her, and left her in the darkness where no one would ever find her. For 43 years I have lived with this knowledge. I have gone to church every Sunday and prayed for forgiveness. I have tried to be a good person, to help my neighbors, to make up for what I did. But nothing has worked. The guilt is still there, heavy and suffocating, and I know it will follow me to my grave unless I do something about it. Last month, I was diagnosed with lung cancer. The doctors say I have maybe a year, maybe less, and I realize that I am running out of time to make this right. Dorothy's mother is still alive. She is in her 90s now, living in a nursing home, and she still does not know what happened to her daughter. She deserves to know. Dorothy deserves to be brought home and buried properly. And those 3 buyers, whoever they were, their families deserve to know what happened to them too. So I am telling this story now. I am putting it on record. I have already contacted the authorities and told them everything I know. I have given them the locations of the caves, described the landmarks, drawn the maps. They are planning to search the areas in the coming weeks. I do not know if they will find anything. 43 years is a long time, and nature has a way of reclaiming what we try to hide. But I have to try. I know this confession will not absolve me. I know I am guilty of being an accessory to murder, of helping to cover up crimes, of letting an innocent woman die because I was too afraid to do the right thing. I know I will be arrested once the authorities confirm what I have told them. I know I will probably die in prison, but I do not care anymore. I am tired of carrying this weight. I am tired of seeing Dorothy's face in my dreams, tired of hearing her voice asking me why I did not save her. If Wade is still alive, I hope they find him too. I hope he pays for what he did. But even if they never catch him, even if he dies free and unpunished, at least Dorothy will be found. At least her mother will have answers. At least she can be laid to rest the way she deserves. I want to make something clear. Dorothy was a good person. She was kind and smart and brave, and she did not deserve what happened to her. She got involved in this business because she was trying to survive, same as the rest of us. But she had a conscience. She had a line she would not cross. And that is what got her killed. If I could go back and change things, I would. I would tell Wade no when he wanted to meet those buyers. I would go to the police the moment those people were shot. I would protect Dorothy instead of letting her become another victim. But I cannot go back. All I can do is tell the truth now and hope that it matters. I hope Dorothy's mother can find some peace. I hope Dorothy's spirit, wherever it is, knows that I never forgot about her, that I never stopped feeling guilty, and that I am finally doing what I should have done 43 years ago. To anyone listening to this, I want you to understand something. Evil does not always look like evil. Sometimes it looks like a cousin you grew up with, someone you trusted, someone you thought you knew. And cowardice does not always feel like cowardice. Sometimes it feels like survival, like self-preservation, like the only choice you have. But in the end, staying silent when you know the truth makes you complicit. It makes you guilty too. I am guilty. I have been guilty for 43 years, and soon everyone will know it. But at least Dorothy will come home. At least she will not be forgotten anymore. And maybe, just maybe, that will be enough. I need to be clear about something right from the start. My wife Margaret and I are not the kind of people who believe in monsters. We are both retired school teachers from Asheville. We read books. We watch documentaries. We live in reality. For 38 years, we approached life with logic and reason, and we raised our children to do the same. We do not believe in ghosts or aliens or creatures that science has not documented. Or at least, we did not believe in those things until October of 2019. Every autumn for the past 15 years, Margaret and I have rented the same cabin in the Pisgah National Forest. It sits about 8 miles down a gravel forest service road, far enough from civilization that you cannot hear traffic or see lights from other properties. The cabin belongs to a friend of ours who uses it maybe twice a year and is happy to let us stay there for a week each fall. We go there to disconnect, to read, to hike the surrounding trails, and to enjoy the quiet that comes with being truly alone in the wilderness. It has always been peaceful. It has always been safe. Until it was not. We arrived on a Sunday afternoon in mid-October. The leaves were at peak color, the weather forecast looked perfect, and we were both looking forward to a week of solitude. We unpacked our supplies, settled into the cabin, and spent the evening reading by the wood stove. Everything was exactly as it had been every other year. We went to bed around 10 o'clock, comfortable and content. I woke sometime after midnight to a sound I could not immediately identify. It was rhythmic and heavy, like footsteps, but wrong somehow. Too slow, too deliberate. I lay there in the darkness listening, trying to convince myself it was a deer or maybe a bear passing through the property. But the sound continued, circling the cabin in a way that no animal would move. Animals do not walk in perfect circles around human structures. They do not move with that kind of purpose. Margaret woke beside me and whispered, asking if I heard it too. I told her I did. We lay there, not moving, barely breathing, listening to whatever it was walking around our cabin. The footsteps were heavy enough that we could feel them through the floor, a faint vibration with each impact. And then they stopped. Right outside our bedroom window. Margaret sat up and looked toward the window. The curtains were drawn, but there was a gap of maybe 2 inches where they did not quite meet. She stared at that gap for several seconds, and then she made a sound I had never heard her make before, a small, choked gasp that conveyed pure terror. I asked her what she saw, but she could not speak. She just pointed at the window with a shaking hand. I got out of bed and moved toward the window, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I reached for the curtain, hesitated, and then pulled it back just enough to look outside. There was a face looking back at me, but it was not a human face, even though it was arranged like one. The eyes were too large, set too far apart, and they reflected the moonlight like an animal's eyes. The nose was flat and wide, the mouth too broad, and the face was at least 7 feet off the ground. I stumbled backward, letting the curtain fall closed. Margaret grabbed my arm, asking me what it was. I could not answer her because I did not know. I did not have words for what I had just seen. We stood there in the darkness, frozen, waiting for something to happen. And then we heard it move again. The footsteps resumed, continuing around the cabin until they reached the back door. The door handle rattled. Whatever was out there was testing it, seeing if it would open. The door was locked. We had checked it before going to bed the same way we checked it every night. But hearing that handle rattle, knowing that something was on the other side trying to get in, made me question whether a simple lock would be enough. The rattling stopped after a few seconds, and the footsteps moved away, heading toward the front of the cabin. We heard them climb onto the front porch. We heard the boards creak under the weight. And then we heard breathing, deep, slow breaths just outside the front door. We did not sleep for the rest of that night. We sat in the bedroom with the door closed, a dresser pushed against it, and a fireplace poker in my hands. We listened as that thing circled the cabin twice more before finally moving away into the forest. As soon as the sun came up, we went outside to look for evidence of what had been there. The handprints were the first thing we found. They were on the bedroom window, pressed against the glass, massive and clear. Each hand had to be nearly twice the size of mine, with fingers that were too long and palms that were unnaturally wide. We took photographs, we measured them, and then we found the footprints in the soft earth around the cabin. They were enormous, at least 18 inches long and 7 inches wide, with a stride length that suggested something much taller than any human. Margaret wanted to leave immediately. She started packing our things while I examined the prints more closely, trying to make sense of them. But even as I looked at the evidence, even as I took dozens of photographs, part of me was still trying to rationalize what we had experienced. Maybe it was a person in some kind of costume. Maybe it was an elaborate prank. Maybe we had both been dreaming and the prints were from a bear that happened to stand against the window. But I knew those explanations were nonsense. I knew what I had seen, and I knew that we needed to get out of those woods as quickly as possible. We finished packing within an hour and loaded everything into our car. The cabin sat at the end of a 2-mile driveway that connected to the Forest Service Road, which then connected to a paved highway another 6 miles away. We started driving out, both of us silent, both of us watching the tree line on either side of the narrow gravel drive. We made it maybe half a mile before Margaret screamed and pointed to the left. Something was moving through the trees parallel to the driveway, keeping pace with our car. I accelerated, and whatever it was accelerated too. I caught glimpses of it between the trees, tall, broad across the shoulders, covered in dark hair, moving on 2 legs with a loping gait that covered ground impossibly fast. I pressed the accelerator harder, pushing our car as fast as I dared on the rough gravel road. The thing kept pace with us for another 1/4 mile before falling back. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see it burst from the trees behind us, but it did not. When we finally reached the paved highway, I did not slow down until we were 10 miles away from that forest. We went straight to the ranger station and reported what had happened. The ranger on duty listened to our story with a polite but skeptical expression. When we showed him the photographs of the handprints and footprints, his expression changed. He studied the images for a long time, zooming in on details, and then he asked us exactly where the cabin was located. We gave him the coordinates. He wrote them down, thanked us for the report, and told us that someone would investigate. We never heard back from them. I called the ranger station 3 times over the next 2 weeks, and each time I was told that the report was still under review. Eventually, I stopped calling. What was the point? They were not going to tell us anything. They were not going to confirm what we already knew. Margaret and I spent weeks researching similar encounters. We found hundreds of reports from the Appalachian region describing creatures that matched what we had seen. Tall bipedal figures covered in hair, faces that were almost human but not quite, behavior that suggested intelligence and intent. The reports went back decades, even centuries if you included folklore and indigenous accounts. We were not the first people to see something like this, and we would not be the last. But finding those reports did not bring us comfort. If anything, it made things worse. Because if these creatures were real, if they existed in numbers significant enough to generate that many reports, then what did that mean? How had they remained undiscovered by modern science? How did they avoid cameras and researchers and all the technology we have for documenting wildlife? And what did they want? The encounter changed our relationship in ways I did not expect. Margaret became obsessed with researching cryptids, joining online forums, and reading every book she could find on the subject. I retreated in the opposite direction, trying to convince myself that we had experienced some kind of shared delusion or misidentification. We argued about it constantly. She accused me of being in denial. I accused her of losing perspective. The thing we had seen in the woods had not just terrified us. It had created a rift between us that took months to heal. We did not go back to that cabin. Our friend offered to let us stay there the following autumn, but we declined. I do not think we will ever go back. Margaret still has nightmares about that face in the window, about those massive hands pressed against the glass. I still think about how it followed us through the woods, how it kept pace with our car, how it seemed to be testing us, deciding whether we were prey or just something to observe. The photographs we took have been examined by several researchers who specialize in cryptozoology. They tell us the prints are consistent with other documented encounters. They tell us that the size and proportions rule out any known animal, They tell us that we are lucky to have gotten away, but none of them can tell us what it actually was. They have theories but no answers. And I have come to accept that we may never have answers. I'm telling this story now because Margaret and I agreed that people should know. We are not asking anyone to believe us. We understand how this sounds. We understand that most people will dismiss our account as misidentification or fabrication. But we know what we saw. We know what we experienced, and we know that there is something in those mountains, something large and intelligent and very much real, that does not want to be found. If you hike or camp in the Appalachian wilderness, please be careful. Pay attention to your surroundings. If you hear something circling your campsite at night, if you see footprints that are too large to be human, if you feel like you are being watched, trust those instincts. Leave. Do not try to investigate. Do not try to get closer. These things, whatever they are not benign curiosities. They are apex predators, and we do not belong in their territory. Margaret and I spent our entire adult lives teaching children to think critically, to question claims, to demand evidence. We still believe in those principles, but we also believe in what we saw. And we believe that science does not have all the answers yet. There are things in this world that exist beyond our current understanding, and sometimes encountering them changes everything you thought you knew about reality. We are not the same people we were before that night. We cannot be. Because we know now that monsters are real, that they walk in the deep woods where no one can see them, and that sometimes, if you are unlucky enough, they let you see them too. For 12 summers, I worked as a fire watcher in a tower deep in the Cherokee National Forest. The job was perfect for me because I do not like people much, and up there you could go weeks without seeing another soul. The tower sat on the highest peak in a range of mountains that stretched for miles in every direction. And my only company was the wind, the birds, and the occasional black bear that would wander past the base of the structure. I spent my days scanning the horizon for smoke, reading books, and maintaining the equipment. It was solitary work, sometimes monotonous, but I loved it. At least I loved it until I found the logbook. My name is Evelyn. I am 53 years old now, and I have not set foot in a fire tower since the summer of 2017. What I am about to tell you is the reason why. The tower I worked in was built in 1952. One of dozens constructed across the Appalachian region during an era when fire watching was done by human eyes rather than satellites and sensors. Most of those towers have been decommissioned and torn down, but a few remain in operation, staffed during the dry months when wildfire risk is highest. Mine was Tower 17, accessible only by a hiking trail that climbed nearly 2,000 feet in elevation over the course of 3 miles. Supplies were brought in by pack mule twice a month, and communication with the ranger station was maintained through a 2-way radio that worked maybe 70% of the time. I started my 12th season in June of 2017. The hike up was familiar, almost meditative, and when I reached the tower, I felt the same sense of relief I always felt when leaving the world below behind. I climbed the stairs, unlocked the cabin at the top, and began setting up for the summer. The cabin was small, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, with windows on all sides, a desk for the radio and logbooks, a cot in the corner, and a small wood stove for the cold nights. Everything was exactly as I had left it the previous September. I was organizing the supply closet on my second day when I found the old logbook. It had fallen behind a shelf, wedged between the wall and the back panel, and I only discovered it because I was doing a more thorough cleaning than usual. The logbook was bound in cracked leather, the pages yellowed and brittle. I opened it carefully and saw that the entries dated back to 1963. The fire watcher that year had been a man named Gerald. I sat down and began reading. The early entries were routine. Gerald documented weather conditions, visibility ranges, and a few small smoke sightings that turned out to be controlled burns or campfires. His handwriting was neat and precise, the entries methodical. He seemed professional, perhaps a little lonely, but overall competent. I kept reading, skipping ahead through the summer months, and that is when the entries began to change. In late July, Gerald wrote about seeing smoke on the western horizon. He radioed it in, gave the coordinates, and waited for confirmation. But when the Rangers investigated, they found nothing. No fire, no recent burn, no explanation for the smoke Gerald had reported. He wrote that he was certain of what he had seen, that his eyes were good and his instruments were calibrated correctly. The Rangers told him to be more careful with his observations. A week later, he reported smoke again. Same direction, same description. Again, the Rangers found nothing. Gerald's entries became defensive. He insisted he was not imagining things, that he had been doing this job for months without a single false report, and that something was wrong. The Rangers warned him that repeated false alarms could result in his termination. But Gerald kept seeing the smoke. He reported it 5 more times over the next 2 weeks, and each time the Rangers found nothing. His handwriting became less neat, the entries more frantic. He wrote about how the smoke would appear in the same location each time, always at dusk, always lasting for exactly 20 minutes before disappearing. He wrote about how it did not behave like normal smoke, how it rose straight up without dispersing, how it seemed almost solid. And then he started writing about the people. In an entry dated August 14th, Gerald described seeing figures walking through the forest below the tower. He counted 12 of them, moving in a single file line, all wearing what appeared to be dark clothing. They walked in perfect formation, evenly spaced, moving through terrain that should have been nearly impossible to traverse in such an organized manner. He watched them for over an hour until they disappeared into a ravine on the northern slope. Gerald radioed the ranger station to report what he had seen. They asked if he had any reason to believe the individuals were in distress or engaged in illegal activity. He said no, they just seemed strange. The Rangers told him that hikers sometimes travel in groups and that there was nothing unusual about people being in the forest. But Gerald wrote that these were not hikers. He wrote that they moved wrong, that their pace never varied, that they did not stop to rest or drink water or adjust their packs. He wrote that they moved like they were being controlled. The entries continued to deteriorate. Gerald saw the figures 3 more times over the next week, always in formation, always moving with that same mechanical precision. He became convinced that something was happening in the forest, something that the Rangers either did not understand or did not want to acknowledge. He stopped calling in his sightings of the figures because the Rangers had stopped taking him seriously. On August 26th, Gerald wrote that he had decided to leave the tower and investigate on his own. He wrote that he was going to hike down to the ravine where he had seen the figures disappear, that he was going to find out what was going on, and that he would radio back once he had answers. That was the last entry in the logbook. The rest of the pages were blank. I sat there in the tower holding that old logbook and felt a chill run through me despite the summer heat. I knew I should report the finding to the ranger station, but I was curious. I opened the current logbook and flipped through the records from previous fire watchers. None of them mentioned Gerald. None of them mentioned finding an old logbook. It was as if those entries had been forgotten or deliberately ignored. That night, I scanned the western horizon as the sun began to set, and I saw the smoke. It rose from the exact location Gerald had described, a column of gray that climbed straight into the sky without bending or dispersing. I grabbed my binoculars and focused on it, trying to determine what might be burning. But I could not see flames, could not see a source. Just that impossible column of smoke. I radioed the ranger station. I gave them the coordinates, described what I was seeing. They told me they would send someone to investigate in the morning. I watched the smoke for exactly 20 minutes, timing it on my watch. And then it vanished. Not gradually, not fading away. It just stopped existing as if someone had turned off a switch. I did not sleep that night. I kept looking out the window, scanning the forest below, half expecting to see those figures Gerald had described. And just after midnight, I saw them. 12 shapes moving through the trees in perfect formation, evenly spaced, heading north toward the ravine. I grabbed my binoculars and tried to get a better look, but the moonlight was too dim and the canopy too thick. All I could make out were the shapes, dark and human-sized, moving with that same mechanical precision Gerald had written about. I radioed the ranger station again. The night operator sounded annoyed, but he took my report. He asked if the individuals appeared to be in distress. I said no, but that something about them was wrong. He told me he would note it in the log and that someone would follow up in the morning. I could hear in his voice that he did not believe me, that he thought I was wasting his time. Over the next 2 weeks, I saw the smoke 6 more times. Always at dusk, always in the same location, always lasting exactly 20 minutes. I saw the figures 4 more times, always at night, always moving in formation. And with each sighting, I understood more and more why Gerald had become obsessed, why his entries had become frantic and desperate. Because there was something deeply wrong happening in those woods, something that defied explanation. I started reading everything I could find about the area's history. I learned that the ravine where the figures always disappeared had been the site of a mining disaster in 1889. 37 men had been killed when a shaft collapsed, trapping them underground. Their bodies were never recovered. The mine had been sealed and abandoned, and over the decades, the forest had reclaimed the land. But the mine was still there, somewhere beneath the surface, and those men were still in it. I became convinced that what I was seeing was connected to that disaster. I do not know if it was the ghosts of those miners, still walking their route to the mine entrance each night, or something else that had attached itself to that tragedy. But I knew I was seeing something that should not be possible, something that existed outside the boundaries of what I understood about the world. The radio began malfunctioning in early August. It would work fine most of the time, but whenever I tried to report the smoke or the figures, the signal would degrade into static. I would hear voices sometimes, fragments of conversations that did not sound like anyone from the ranger station. Once, I heard someone say my name, not asking for me, just stating it. Evelyn, calm and clear through the static. I turned off the radio and did not turn it back on for 2 days. On August 18th, I made the decision to leave. I had been contracted through September, but I did not care. I packed my essential belongings, left a note explaining that I was experiencing equipment malfunctions, and felt it was unsafe to remain alone in the tower, and I hiked down the mountain. I did not look back. I reported everything to the ranger station in person. I gave them Gerald's logbook. I described what I had seen in detail. The ranger I spoke with listened politely, took notes, and thanked me for the report. 2 weeks later, I received a letter informing me that Tower 17 was being decommissioned due to budget constraints and advances in fire detection technology. They thanked me for my years of service and offered me a position at a different tower in Virginia. I declined. Last year, I saw a news article about a hiker who had gotten lost in the Cherokee National Forest. Search and rescue teams had been looking for him for 3 days when they finally found him, disoriented and dehydrated, near an old ravine on the northern slope of a mountain. The hiker claimed he had followed a group of people he thought were part of a search party, but when he called out to them, they did not respond. He followed them for hours, trying to catch up, until he realized they were leading him deeper into the forest rather than out of it. He finally stopped following them when they reached the ravine and began descending into it. disappearing one by one into a crevice he had not noticed before. When I read that article, I knew exactly which ravine he was talking about. I knew exactly what he had seen. And I knew that whatever is in those woods, whatever Gerald went looking for and never came back from, is still there. Still walking, still waiting. I do not know what happened to Gerald. The rangers claim to have no record of a fire watcher by that name, though the logbook proves he existed. I do not know if he found what he was looking for in that ravine, or if it found him. But I know I made the right choice by leaving, and I know I will never work in a fire tower again. I went hunting with my Uncle Raymond exactly once. That was November of 1996, and I was 15 years old. What happened out there is why I never went back and why I did not speak to Raymond again until his funeral last year. My name is Clarence. I grew up in eastern Kentucky in a town so small that everyone knew everyone else's business. Hunting was not just a hobby there. It was a tradition, something passed down from fathers to sons, a way of proving you understood the land and could provide for yourself. My own father had died when I was 12, and my Uncle Raymond had stepped in to fill that role. He was my father's older brother, a man who had spent his entire life in those mountains and knew them better than anyone I had ever met. When he invited me on my first hunting trip, I was excited. I thought it would be a rite of passage, a chance to prove I was becoming a man. We left on a Saturday morning in mid-November. Raymond picked me up before dawn, and we drove for nearly 2 hours on progressively smaller roads until we reached a dirt track that barely qualified as a path. We followed it for another 30 minutes, the truck bouncing over ruts and rocks until we reached a clearing where Raymond said we would park. From there, he explained, we would hike another 3 miles to his hunting camp. The camp was a small cabin that Raymond and some friends had built years earlier. It was not much more than 4 walls and a roof, with a wood stove for heat and a couple of cots for sleeping. No electricity, no running water, no connection to the outside world. Raymond said that was the point. Out there, you were truly alone with nature, forced to rely on your skills and your instincts. We reached the camp around noon. Raymond showed me how to set up my gear, how to prepare the cabin for our stay, and how to scout the surrounding area for game trails. We spent the afternoon hiking through the woods, and Raymond pointed out signs I would have never noticed on my own. Deer tracks, scat, scrapes on trees where bucks had rubbed their antlers. He was a good teacher, patient and knowledgeable, and I felt like I was finally learning something important. On the second day, we split up to cover more ground. Raymond told me to follow a ridge to the east while he worked his way along a creek to the south. We agreed to meet back at camp by 4 o'clock. I spent the day moving slowly through the forest, practicing the stalking techniques Raymond had taught me, and I felt confident and capable. I did not see any deer, but I did not mind. Just being out there alone in the wilderness felt like enough. I made it back to camp around 3:30. Raymond was not there yet, so I started a fire in the stove and waited. 4 o'clock came and went, then 5. By 5:30 I was starting to worry, but I told myself that Raymond knew these woods and would be fine. He probably just lost track of time or found a good spot and decided to wait until dark. He finally came back just after sunset, moving fast, his face tight with tension. He did not say anything at first. He just walked into the cabin, grabbed his pack, and started throwing his gear into it. I asked him what was wrong, but he told me to pack my things. We were leaving. Now. I started to argue, started to ask why, but something in his expression stopped me. Raymond was scared. I had never seen him scared before, and that frightened me more than anything else. I packed my gear as quickly as I could, and within 10 minutes we were hiking back toward the truck. Raymond set a brutal pace, pushing through the darkness with only a flashlight to guide us. I struggled to keep up, branches whipping at my face, my pack bouncing painfully against my back. It was not until we were halfway to the truck that I realized Raymond was carrying something extra. A plastic bag, the kind you get at grocery stores, bulging with items I could not identify. I asked him what it was, but he told me to keep moving and not ask questions. We made it to the truck around 9 o'clock. My legs were shaking from exhaustion, my lungs burning, but Raymond did not let me rest. He threw our gear in the bed of the truck, climbed into the driver's seat, and started the engine. We drove out of those mountains without stopping, without speaking, and did not slow down until we were on the main highway heading back toward town. Finally, I asked him again what had happened. Raymond was quiet for a long time, his hands tight on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough. He told me he had found a campsite, a recent one, maybe a day or two old. Whoever had been there had left in a hurry, but they had hidden something before they left. Raymond had found it buried under a log near the fire pit. He did not tell me what it was, but he said it was bad, real bad. And he said we could not talk about it, not to anyone, not ever. I asked if we should tell the police. Raymond looked at me like I had suggested something insane. He said no, absolutely not. That we were not going to get involved in whatever had happened out there. He said that some things were better left alone, that some people were dangerous in ways I did not understand, and that the best thing we could do was forget we had ever been there. When we got back to town, Raymond pulled into an alley behind the post office. He took that plastic bag from behind his seat, walked over to a mailbox, and dropped something inside. I did not see what it was, but I saw that the bag was addressed and stamped, ready to be mailed. He came back to the truck and told me that he had taken care of it, that the right people would get what they needed, and that we were never going to speak of this again. He made me promise, made me swear on my father's grave that I would never tell anyone what had happened. I kept that promise for a long time. I did not tell my mother where we had really been, or why we had come back early. I did not tell my friends about the camping trip, and I did not speak to Raymond about it, even though I saw him at family gatherings and holidays. There was an unspoken agreement between us that the subject was closed. It was not until 4 months later that I understood what Raymond had found. There was a story on the news about a serial killer who had been operating in eastern Kentucky and southern West Virginia. He had been abducting women from small towns, taking them into the mountains and killing them. The police had arrested him after receiving an anonymous tip that led them to evidence hidden in a storage unit. The evidence included personal items belonging to 5 different women, all of whom had been reported missing over the previous 2 years. I remember watching that news report and feeling my stomach drop. I remember seeing the photos of those women, reading their names and understanding that Raymond had found something that belonged to them. That plastic bag he had mailed had contained evidence that helped put a killer in prison, and Raymond had known exactly what he was dealing with when he found it. I wanted to talk to him about it, to ask him how he had known, to understand why he had been so scared, but every time I tried to bring it up, he shut me down. He would change the subject or walk away, making it clear that the conversation was not going to happen. Over the years, I stopped trying. I accepted that Raymond had his reasons for keeping quiet, and I respected them. Raymond died last year from a heart attack. He was 71 years old. At his funeral, his daughter asked me to help go through his belongings, to sort out what should be kept and what should be donated. I agreed, and while going through boxes in his attic, I found a folder filled with newspaper clippings, articles about missing women, about unsolved disappearances, about bodies found in the woods. Some of the articles were decades old. There was also a map, a topographic map of the mountains where we had gone hunting, with dozens of locations marked in red ink. Notes written in Raymond's handwriting beside each mark. Dates, descriptions, observations. I realized that Raymond had been going back to those mountains for years. searching, documenting, trying to piece together something that law enforcement had missed. I do not know if Raymond had his own history with those woods, or if he had simply been trying to do the right thing in his own way. I do not know if he had found other evidence over the years, or if that hunting trip with me had been the first and only time. But I understand now why he had been so scared that day, and why he had made me promise never to speak of it. He had been protecting me from something dark and dangerous, something he had been dealing with alone for most of his life. I think about that trip sometimes, about the look on Raymond's face when he came back to camp that evening. I think about how quickly he moved, how determined he was to get us out of there. And I think about those women, about how Raymond's actions had helped bring them justice, even if no one ever knew he was the one who had done it. Raymond never asked for recognition. He never told anyone what he had done. He just carried that weight alone, the way he carried so many other things. And now that he is gone, I am the only person who knows the truth. I am telling this story because I think Raymond deserves to be remembered for the good he did, even if he never wanted anyone to know about it. My wife, Betty, died 3 years ago from cancer. We had 41 good years together, and I thought I knew everything about her. Then I went back to the place where we met, and I learned she had been keeping a secret from me our entire marriage. My name is Leonard. I am 68 years old now, and what I am about to tell you has shaken everything I believed about the woman I loved. I do not know if sharing this story will bring me peace or just make the guilt worse, but I need to say it out loud. I need someone else to know. Betty and I met in 1978 at a cave system in the Blue Ridge Mountains. We were both part of an amateur spelunking group that met once a month to explore different cave networks in the region. I was 25, working as an accountant, looking for some adventure to break up the monotony of my life. Betty was 23, working at a library, and she had joined the group a few months before me. We were paired together on our first expedition because we were both beginners, and by the end of that day, I knew I wanted to marry her. The cave system where we met was called Whisper Caverns, though that was not its official name. The locals called it that because of the acoustics inside. Sound traveled in strange ways through those passages, echoing and distorting until you could not tell where anything was coming from. Our group leader warned us about it, told us to stay together and not wander off because it was easy to get disoriented. Betty and I spent that whole day underground, squeezing through narrow passages, wading through cold water, marveling at the rock formations that had taken thousands of years to form. At one point, we reached a junction where the main passage split into 3 different tunnels. Our group leader told us the left and center passages had been fully explored, but the right passage led to an unstable section that had been closed off. Betty stared at that right passage for a long time, longer than seemed normal, and when I asked if she was okay, she just nodded and turned away. We got married 2 years later, built a life together, had 3 children. Betty worked as a librarian until she retired, and I worked my way up to partner at my accounting firm. We were happy, or at least I thought we were. Betty was always a little distant sometimes, like her mind was somewhere else. But I figured that was just part of who she was. Everyone has their private thoughts. After she died, I fell into a depression that I could not shake. The house felt empty without her. Everything reminded me of her. I started driving around aimlessly just to get out of the house, and one day I found myself near Whisper Caverns. I had not been back there since that first expedition, but I felt drawn to it. I parked at the trailhead and hiked up to the cave entrance. The cave system was no longer open to the public. There was a chain-link fence across the entrance with warning signs about structural instability and the danger of entering without authorization. But the fence had a gap where someone had cut through it, and I could see footprints in the mud leading inside. I should have turned around. I should have respected the warnings. But I was thinking about Betty, about that day we met, and I wanted to feel close to her again. I squeezed through the gap in the fence and entered the cave. I had a flashlight with me, nothing else. No proper equipment, no experience, no one who knew where I was. It was stupid and reckless, but grief makes you do stupid things. I followed the main passage, recognizing some of the formations from decades earlier. The cave looked smaller than I remembered, which I suppose makes sense. Everything seems bigger when you are young. I reached the junction where the passage split into 3 tunnels, and I stood there looking at the right passage, the one that had been closed off. The barriers that had been there in 1978 were gone now, torn down or rotted away. And I heard singing. A woman's voice, distant and echoing, coming from somewhere deep in that right passage. The melody was beautiful, haunting, and I could not make out the words. But the voice sounded like Betty. I know how that sounds. I know it does not make sense. But I heard it clearly, and every rational part of my brain shut down. I walked into that right passage, following the sound, calling out Betty's name. The passage narrowed and twisted, forcing me to crawl in places, and the singing continued ahead of me, always just out of reach. I do not know how long I followed that voice. It could have been 30 minutes or 2 hours. Time felt strange in there, stretched and distorted. Eventually, I reached a section where the passage had partially collapsed. There were rocks piled up, blocking most of the tunnel, but there was a gap at the top large enough for me to shine my light through. On the other side of the collapse, carved into the stone wall, were names. Dozens of them, maybe more, scratched into the rock with something sharp. I recognized some of them immediately. Sarah Hendricks, Rebecca Cole, Maria Vasquez. These were names I knew from news reports, from missing person cases that had never been solved. Women who had disappeared in this region between 1972 and 1977. And among those names I saw Betty's. Betty Morrison, her maiden name carved deep into the stone. Below her name was a date. June 12, 1975, 3 years before I met her. I sat there staring at that wall, trying to make sense of it. Betty had never mentioned being in this cave system before we met. She had told me she was new to spelunking, that our group was her first real experience with it. But her name was on that wall, carved alongside the names of women who had vanished. The singing stopped. The cave went silent except for the sound of my own breathing. I backed away from the collapse, suddenly very aware of how alone I was, how deep underground, how far from help. I turned around and started making my way back to the entrance, moving as fast as I could without panicking. When I finally got out of the cave, it was dark outside. My phone said it was after midnight. I had been underground for nearly 8 hours, though it had felt like less than 2. I spent the next week researching everything I could find about those missing women. Most of the cases were cold, the investigations abandoned after years of no leads. The women had all disappeared from towns within 50 miles of Whisper Caverns, all of them between the ages of 19 and 26. None of them had ever been found. I went through Betty's belongings looking for anything that might explain what I had seen. In a box in the attic, I found her old journals. She had been keeping them since she was a teenager, and I had never read them before. It felt like a violation of her privacy, but I needed to understand. The entry from June 1975 was brief. Betty wrote that she had gone caving with her childhood friend Jennifer. They had gotten separated from their group and ended up in a passage they did not recognize. Jennifer had heard singing and followed it deeper into the cave. Betty had tried to stop her, but Jennifer would not listen. Betty watched her friend disappear into a narrow tunnel, still following that voice, and Betty had been too afraid to go after her. She had found her way back to the main passage and told the group leaders that Jennifer had gotten lost. Search parties looked for weeks but found nothing. Betty wrote that she went back to the cave alone several times over the next 2 years, trying to find Jennifer, trying to understand what had happened. She could hear the singing too, but she never followed it. Instead, she would carve names into the wall in that collapsed section, names of women she had read about in newspapers, women who had gone missing near the caves. She wrote that it felt like a memorial, a way of remembering the people that something in those caves had taken. The last entry about the caves was from 1978, right before Betty joined the spelunking group. She wrote that she was going to stop going back, that she needed to move on with her life, but that she would never forget Jennifer. She wrote that the caves were hungry, that something lived in the deep passages that called to people, and that she was one of the lucky ones who had been strong enough not to answer. Betty never told me any of this. She never mentioned Jennifer or the singing or the names on the wall. She kept it locked inside for 41 years, carrying that guilt and that knowledge alone. And I never suspected. I never asked the right questions. I never saw the pain she was hiding. I have not gone back to Whisper Cavern since that night. I reported what I found to the authorities, told them about the names on the wall, but they treated it as the confused rambling of a grieving widower. They said the cave system had been thoroughly explored years ago and that there was no evidence of foul play. They said the names were probably graffiti, that people had been sneaking into those caves for decades. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And I know that Betty spent our entire marriage haunted by something she could not escape. Something that called to her from those dark passages. Something that had taken her friend and so many others. I miss Betty every day, but now I also mourn for the woman I never really knew. The woman who carried such a terrible burden and never felt like she could share it with me. I wish she had trusted me enough to tell me. I wish I had been observant enough to see that she was struggling. But most of all, I wish I had never gone back to that cave, because now I carry the same burden she did. And the singing has followed me home. I have been a game warden in these mountains for 19 years. I have found poachers, illegal grows, and more dead hunters than I care to remember. But nothing prepared me for what I found in the summer of 2022 when I was tracking what I thought was a wounded bear. My name is Lorraine, and I work in a district that covers roughly 200 square miles of the Nantahala National Forest in North Carolina. It is remote country, the kind where you can hike for days without seeing another person, and the kind where people go missing more often than anyone wants to admit. My job is to enforce wildlife regulations, assist with search and rescue operations, and generally keep an eye on things that most people never see. The call came in on a Tuesday morning in late June. A backpacker had reported seeing a bear with what looked like an injury to its hind leg, dragging itself through the undergrowth about 6 miles from the nearest trailhead. Injured bears can be dangerous, and if the injury was severe enough, the animal might need to be euthanized. I grabbed my gear, called in my location to dispatch, and headed out. The trail was easy enough to follow at first. The bear had left clear signs: broken branches, disturbed leaf litter, and spots of blood on the ground. But after about 3 miles, the trail started to seem wrong. The blood was too frequent, too much for a leg injury. And the pattern of movement was not consistent with a bear dragging a wounded limb. It looked more like something bleeding heavily and struggling to stay upright. I followed the trail for another 2 miles, moving deeper into an area I had never patrolled before. The terrain became increasingly difficult, thick with rhododendron and mountain laurel that formed impenetrable tangles. I was about to turn back and call for aerial support when I noticed something through the vegetation. A structure. A building where no building should be. I pushed through the undergrowth and found myself standing in front of a small log cabin. It was old, constructed from hand-hewn logs that had weathered to a dark gray, with a stone chimney and a tin roof that was mostly intact. There were no roads anywhere near this location, no trails, nothing on any map or database that indicated human habitation. Yet here was a cabin, and smoke was rising from the chimney. I called out, identifying myself as a game warden. No response. I approached the front door and knocked. Still nothing. The door was unlocked, so I pushed it open and stepped inside. The interior was dim, lit only by the daylight coming through the door and a single small window. There was a woman sitting in a rocking chair near the fireplace, wrapped in a wool blanket despite the summer heat. She looked up at me with eyes that seemed both present and distant at the same time. I asked if she was okay, if she needed help. She stared at me for several long seconds before speaking. When she did, her voice was rough, like she had not used it in a long time. She asked me what year it was. The question caught me off guard. I told her it was 2022. She closed her eyes and started crying, silent tears running down her face. She said that was not possible, that she had only been here for 2 months, that it should still be 1998. I realized then that I was looking at someone who needed immediate medical attention and probably psychiatric evaluation. I radioed for assistance, giving my coordinates and requesting a medical evacuation. While I waited, I tried to get information from the woman. She told me her name was Lorraine, same as mine, which was the first of many strange coincidences. She said she had been hiking the Appalachian Trail in the spring of 1998 when she had gotten lost during a storm. She found this cabin and took shelter, planning to leave as soon as the weather cleared. But the weather never cleared. Days turned into weeks and she could not find her way back to the trail. She survived by fishing in a nearby creek and eating supplies she found stored in the cabin. I looked around the cabin more carefully. There were no modern supplies, no gear that would indicate she had arrived recently. Everything was old, primitive. Hand tools, oil lamps, canned goods with labels I did not recognize. It looked like the cabin had been abandoned decades ago. The helicopter arrived within an hour. The paramedics examined the woman and determined she was severely malnourished and dehydrated, but otherwise physically stable. They loaded her onto a stretcher and flew her to the hospital in Asheville. I stayed behind to document the scene and try to make sense of what I had found. I searched the cabin thoroughly. In a drawer, I found an identification card. The name on it was Lorraine Caldwell. The issue date was 1996. I ran the name through our database and found a missing person report from 1998. Lorraine Caldwell, age 24, had disappeared while hiking the Appalachian Trail. She had last been seen at a shelter approximately 12 miles from where I was standing. The photograph in the missing person file showed a young woman with dark hair and a bright smile. The woman I had just found looked like she was in her 70s or 80s. Gray hair, deeply lined face, hands gnarled with arthritis. If she was the same person, she had aged 50 years in what she claimed was 2 months. I documented everything, took photographs, and sealed the cabin as a potential crime scene. The investigation that followed was extensive. Forensic teams examined the cabin, analyzed the woman's DNA, and conducted medical evaluations. The DNA confirmed that the woman was Lorraine Caldwell, but the medical evaluations revealed something impossible. Her biological age was approximately 74 years old. Her cellular degradation, bone density, organ function, everything indicated a woman in her mid-70s. Yet she had clear memories of 1998, could describe events from that year in detail, and insisted she had only been in the cabin for 2 months. Psychologists evaluated her and found no evidence of delusion or false memory syndrome. She genuinely believed everything she was saying. She was confused and frightened by how much time had passed. by the technology she saw in the hospital, by the fact that her parents were now elderly or deceased. The most disturbing part came when investigators interviewed Lorraine's family. Her mother, now in her late 80s, confirmed that Lorraine had disappeared in 1998. But she also said that approximately 2 months after Lorraine went missing, she received a phone call from someone claiming to be in the Forest Service, saying they had found Lorraine alive but injured in a remote cabin. The mother had driven to the ranger station named in the call, but no one there knew anything about it. There was no record of the call, no cabin, no rescue. The family had assumed it was a cruel prank. I spent weeks trying to understand what had happened. I went back to the cabin multiple times, searching for explanations. The area around the structure had anomalous properties. Compasses spun randomly. GPS units gave wildly inaccurate readings. Radio communication was spotty at best, and time felt strange there, though I could never put my finger on exactly why. Other investigators found evidence that the cabin had been standing for well over 100 years. Historical records mentioned a homestead in that approximate location, inhabited by a family in the 1880s who had all disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Local folklore spoke of a place in the mountains where time did not work correctly, where people could enter and emerge years later without realizing any time had passed. The case remains open and unexplained. Lorraine was released from the hospital after 3 months and placed in the care of her elderly mother. But the story does not end well. Lorraine continued to deteriorate rapidly. Within 6 months of being found, she looked like she was in her 90s. A year after her rescue, she died of what doctors described as extreme accelerated aging syndrome. It was as if leaving the cabin had triggered something in her body, causing her to catch up to the time she should have experienced. The cabin was seized by the Forest Service and the area was designated as restricted. The official reason given was unstable terrain and dangerous wildlife activity. The real reason was that 3 more people had gone missing in that area since Lorraine was found, all of them within a quarter mile of the cabin. Search parties found no trace of any of them. I have been instructed not to patrol that section of the forest anymore. The area has been removed from public maps and trail guides. As far as the government is concerned, it does not exist. But I know it is still there, and I know that whatever force or phenomenon exists in that place is still active, still taking people, still distorting time in ways that should not be possible. I think about Lorraine often. I think about how terrified she must have been, spending what felt like 2 months in that cabin, not knowing why she could not find her way out. I think about her mother, who waited 24 years for her daughter to come home, only to lose her again within a year. And I think about those 3 people who have gone missing since, who might be sitting in that cabin right now thinking they have only been there for a few days, not knowing that decades are passing outside. I do not have answers. I do not have explanations that make sense. All I have is the knowledge that there are places in these mountains where the normal rules do not apply, where time moves differently, where people can disappear into something we do not understand. And my job now includes keeping people away from those places, even though I cannot tell them why. The Appalachian Mountains are old, older than anyone can truly comprehend. And sometimes I think that age comes with things we were never meant to encounter, pockets of strangeness that exist outside our understanding of reality. Lorraine Caldwell found one of those pockets, and it cost her everything. In 1983, my friends Norma and Phyllis and I took a wrong turn on a logging road in the Monongahela National Forest. We were lost for 6 hours. The search party said we had only been gone for 45 minutes, and none of us remembered the same thing. My name is Arthur. I am 60 years old now, and what happened on that road has haunted the 3 of us for over 40 years. We meet once a year to talk about it, to compare our memories, and every year those memories become more different, more contradictory, more impossible to reconcile. I do not know what happened to us in those woods. I am not sure I want to know. But I am telling this story because someone needs to document it before the three of us are gone. And the truth, whatever it is, disappears with us. We were college students at West Virginia University, 20 years old, full of confidence and stupidity in equal measure. It was October and we had decided to take a weekend camping trip in the Monongahela. Norma had a car, a beat-up station wagon that barely ran, and she agreed to drive. We left campus on a Friday afternoon, planning to find a campsite, spend the night under the stars, and drive back Sunday morning. The problem started when we missed our turn. We were supposed to take Forest Road 44 to a designated camping area, but we were talking and not paying attention, and we ended up on an unmarked logging road instead. It did not seem like a big deal at first. We figured we would just turn around and backtrack. But the road was narrow, barely wide enough for one vehicle, and there was nowhere to turn around. Norma kept driving, looking for a wide spot or a clearing. The road got worse. What had been gravel turned to dirt, then to mud. The trees pressed in closer on both sides, branches scraping against the car. We started to get nervous, but we kept telling ourselves we would find a place to turn around any minute. Then things got strange. The road straightened out and the surface improved, suddenly smooth and well-maintained. It did not make sense. We had just been on a deteriorating logging road, and now we were on something that looked almost new. Phyllis said maybe we had accidentally found a Forest Service road, something that was maintained but not on our map. We decided to keep going. That is where our memories start to diverge. I remember driving for what felt like hours on that smooth road. The trees on either side were wrong, too uniform, too perfectly spaced. The sunlight filtering through the canopy had a strange quality to it, too golden, almost amber-colored. I kept checking my watch, but the hands did not seem to be moving correctly. I would look down and it would say 3:15, and then I would look again what felt like 30 minutes later and it would still say 3:15. Norma remembers it differently. She says we only drove for maybe 20 minutes on the smooth road before we came to a town. A small town with buildings that looked old, fashioned, like something from the 1950s. She says we drove down the main street and saw people walking on the sidewalks, all of them dressed in clothing that was decades out of date. She says she tried to stop to ask for directions, but every time she slowed down, the people would turn and stare at us with faces that were wrong somehow, features that did not quite line up correctly. Phyllis has a completely different memory. She says we never saw a town. She says the road looped back on itself multiple times, that we would pass the same distinctive tree over and over again, that it was like driving in a circle even though the road appeared straight. She says she saw a vehicle coming toward us at one point, an old pickup truck from the 1950s or 1960s, and that when it got close enough for her to see the driver, the truck just vanished. Not drove past us, not turned off the road. It simply ceased to exist. What we all agree on is this. At some point we were back on the deteriorating logging road. The smooth surface was gone, replaced by mud and ruts again. And the trees were pressing in close, branches scraping the car. It was like we had looped back to where we started, except nothing looked exactly the same. The light was different. The air felt different. And we were all terrified in a way that none of us could articulate. Norma pushed the car as fast as she dared, desperate to get out of those woods. We did not talk. We did not argue about what we had just seen or experienced. We just wanted out. And eventually the logging road dumped us back onto the main highway. We pulled over at a gas station, all of us shaking, and tried to make sense of what had happened. I looked at my watch. It said 9:20. We had left campus at 2:30, missed our turn around 3, and had been on that logging road ever since. 6.5 hours, give or take. But when we called the campus security office to let them know we were okay because we were supposed to check in when we arrived at the campsite, they said they had just been about to send out a search party because we were 15 minutes late. According to them, it was only 3:15. We had been gone for 45 minutes. We argued with them, showed them our watches, insisted that hours had passed. But the dispatcher checked the time on multiple clocks and confirmed it was 3:15. She asked if we had been drinking. We had not touched alcohol. She asked if we were on drugs. We were not. She told us to drive safely and hung up. We checked Norma's car. The odometer showed we had driven 73 miles since leaving campus. But the route we had taken should have been less than 30 miles, even accounting for the wrong turn and the time on the logging road. The gas tank, which had been 3/4 full when we left, was now below a quarter tank. We had burned through fuel like we had been driving for hours. Because we had been. We did not go camping that night. We drove back to campus in silence, and we did not talk about what had happened for almost a month. We were afraid people would think we were crazy. We were afraid we might actually be crazy. But eventually we met up and compared notes, trying to piece together a coherent narrative from our fragmented memories. That is when we discovered how differently we remembered the experience. We spent hours arguing about what we had seen, what had happened, trying to find the common thread. But there was no common thread beyond the basic facts. We took a wrong turn, we got lost, and time did not work the way it was supposed to. Over the years, we have tried to find that logging road again. We have driven every forest road in the Monongahela, hiked the trails, studied maps both old and new. We have never found it. The road we traveled that day does not exist. At least it does not exist on any map we can find. Our memories have continued to change. Not drift or fade the way memories normally do, but actively change. Details that one of us remembered clearly one year will be completely different the next. Norma used to insist she never saw a town, that Phyllis was confused and mixing up memories. Now she describes that town in vivid detail, down to the names on the storefronts and the makes and models of the cars parked on the street. Phyllis used to remember the town too, but now she says she never saw one, that we spent the entire time driving in circles. My own memories have shifted as well. Some years I remember seeing people in the woods, standing motionless among the trees, watching us drive past. Other years I have no memory of any people at all. I remember the road being paved, then dirt, then something else entirely, something that did not look like any road surface I have ever seen. We have tried to find rational explanations. Carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty exhaust system. Shared hallucination from contaminated water or food. Some kind of temporal anomaly or localized time dilation effect. None of these explanations account for all the facts. None of them explain the odometer, the fuel consumption, or the conflicting memories that continue to change decades after the event. 5 years ago, we hired a private investigator to look into historical records for the Monongahela National Forest. We gave him the approximate area where we thought we had made our wrong turn, and we asked him to find any information about unusual occurrences or disappearances. He found 17 cases of people going missing in that region between 1960 and 2005. All of them had last been seen driving on forest roads. None of them were ever found. He also found references in local newspapers to a town that used to exist in that area, a logging community called Ashwood. The town thrived in the 1940s and 1950s, but was completely abandoned by 1962 after the logging company pulled out. According to the records, the town was demolished and the land was reclaimed by the forest. But when we looked at the historical photographs of Ashwood, Norma started crying. She said that was the town she had driven through. She recognized the buildings, the layout of the streets, everything. Except according to the records, Ashwood had been gone for 20 years before we ever set foot in those woods. We do not have answers. We do not understand what happened to us. All we know is that we took a wrong turn, drove into something that should not exist, and came out the other side changed in ways we are still trying to understand. Our memories continue to shift and contradict each other. And sometimes I wonder if we are remembering different versions of the same event, different timelines or realities that somehow intersected on that logging road. What I do know is this: there are places in these mountains where the normal rules break down. Places where time does not work correctly. Where roads appear and disappear. Where entire towns that should be gone still exist in some form. And if you are unlucky enough to find one of those places, you might get out, but you will never be the same.